here with my friends Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald. We've known each other for 20 years?
For
decades.
Yeah. And you have been working this whole time on dissecting the narrative of the West from the point of view of a more spiritual point of view, not just the materialistic point of view, but what we're really seeing today, and we'll go into this, is this the collapse of the dialectic, the collapse of the materialist Western Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, otherwise known as problem, reaction, solution, where it's sort of like both ends are sputtering, both ends are fake, and they're collapsing and into something new. And so we've discussed different ways that this is manifesting, in politics with the collapse of the right and the left wing. I don't think that you can say that either one is, the right has been responsible for more big government build-up and more, the Department of Homeland Security and all these extra government jobs that never existed before, more war, which is really government. That's what government is war. And with the left really just being neoliberal, proponents of bombing Middle Eastern countries and destroying, Libya, Syria, and other governments in the Middle East. So we've seen this new emergence of things on Fox with the ouster of Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly on sexual harassment charges. Fox has sort of has emerged into something somewhat respectable with Tucker Carlson, sort of representing a much younger generation. He brings in a younger audience. I was actually looking at Variety's reports on the cable news stations, and Fox is the most popular cable station, and Tucker's show is the most popular on Fox. So, and I'm not surprised, because he's actually, he's actually more of a libertarian dude if you really look into his,
Right.
He's not he's not a neocon. He's not one of these fake neocons who I don't even know how they get away with.
CNN's kind of imploding.
Right.
By allowing them to talk, and that they have taken over the Democrats. And I don't know why anyone gives them the time of day. They should all be fired and just go away. Your narrative is
they have entrenched power, and we all know that the entrenched power really allows things to continue that shouldn't. But in the series we just completed a few months ago, that's online, about basically the rise of the neocons, which really started back with James Burnham in the 1930s and his work with Trotsky, and eventually leading to him going from communism into becoming a right-wing radical. And he is very much at the core of the thinking that we're talking about the left today and the right being in trouble. Part of the reason the left and the right are in trouble because the United States really developed a very active idea to basically completely subvert any authentic left from emerging in the United States and Europe. Well, when you subvert the left, you actually also subvert the right. And I don't think that they could have imagined that they were really undoing the right too. And I think that's part of what we're witnessing today.
Well, yeah. Well, people didn't realize that in 1946, 1947, and throughout the early 1950s, the CIA was actually invoking a totalitarian control of culture.
Yes.
That was going on. It was coming from the newspapers. It was coming from television. It was coming from radio.
I think it's the same today. If we look at CNN, we're looking at CIA TV basically, and it's just pathetic.
People can see it today, but people need to understand it was actually very present from the very beginning of television, Hollywood, especially post-World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That people don't know, and that's what we get into in the last series, is the cultural Cold War that really became the basis on which everything that we perceived as the American narrative and the freedom narrative and the evil of the Soviet Union was all basically built up at that time.
It's a totalitarian structure that we've been told was free. You know,
Right.
I think I mentioned the last time we spoke that we were in the Soviet Union back in 1987, the last time we were in Russia. And we went there with some Hollywood filmmakers who were trying to get some kind of thing going with the Russian filmmakers. They were they were brilliant people.
Hmm.
And so anyway, one of our guides said, you know, they said, what is it with you Americans? They said, you know, we get people here from all over the world. We get people here from communist countries, from socialist countries, from dictatorships, from capitalist countries. We get people who come here from all over the world. And the only people that tell us are who they're absolutely free are the Americans. All you talk about all the time is how you're free to do this, you're free, 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 free. When in fact, to us, you appear to be the most conformist people in the world.
Well, it's true. I mean, it seems like this idea of America can only exist with an evil Soviet Union. It can only exist. That's why the Russian narrative persists, is because if this dissolves, if the evil Russian Russkies dissolve, that means that we'll cease to exist as we know ourselves.
Well, I think
that may be true to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the United States has ever really truly defined itself outside of that kind of polarity between left and right.
But you see, with all of the immigration and things, we have millions and millions of Russians living in America. Over for generations have been coming here, so they're Americans too. It's like it's incoherent.
Well, remember though, this is certainly not the first time we've seen this kind of thing. In World War II, they put Japanese families basically in concentration camps.
Right.
So the idea that there's an ethnic group that somehow ends up on the short end of the stick in this country is pretty well documented. Aside from what happens to the Native Americans and to obviously the black people, but the idea, I think that there is something special about the hatred of what became the Cold War for Americans and the evil of communism has now been revealed to have nothing to do with communism, and it truly never did. And that's where, going back in history and getting a sense of the origins of these things, I mean, truthfully, you'd have to go back to the 11th century, to the creation of the Russian Orthodox Church, when it split from Rome. And then eventually, you ended up, obviously, with the split that the Church of England produced. These are all incredibly important schisms and ultimately alliances out of convenience that we're now living through today, they're at the very root of the real crisis. There's also a lot of prophecy about the very important role that Russia was going to play. It was prophesied in the Fatima prophecies. It was prophesied by Rudolf Steiner, by Edgar Casey, that there would be a very important role, and not in terms of it being the Soviet Union. In fact, Steiner prophesied it before there was a Soviet Union, and Casey specifically said that it would no longer be the Soviet Union. And so what's happening now...
Same with Fatima, they said that the soil of Russia would be consecrated to Christ, and that was one of the prophecies. Right.
It was, yeah. So you see, in terms of these elites, that's all part of what we like to bring into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Many Americans especially believe the separation of church and state. Well, that is totally untrue. The separation of, I should say, there is actually a merger of very real spiritual power and the power of the state. And that power in 19th century was called, it was a mystical imperialism. It was a term coined to express Cecil Rhodes and his vision for Africa and his willfulness to believe he had the right. And where does this right come from? This is why the Old Testament is very important. That's a manual for war. To win wars, to what? To take power. And that's the foundation of what an empire is. It's to take authority over someone or something else. And so now we're living at a point where we're seeing that empires basically don't really seem to end very well. You can go back to Samaria and you can see in the most ancient civilization that is directly connected to what we consider civilizations to be, a horrible ending that is documented. And when you look at it, you realize we're really not living in any different kind of ending. The big difference, of course, is that we now have the potential to blow up the entire world. That's the only real major difference, as opposed to what would happen at the end of Samaria. But in terms of this mystical power, it does seem that leadership, once it gets caught up in the mystical power, it becomes more and more diluted and delusional. That's why, I think the expression we came up with, late stage imperial dementia, seems to be a very real condition at the end of empires. And so these are all the ideas that we've been, witnessing it. Our personal catch on it was when we witnessed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. We saw a total collapse eventually within the left against what we instinctively knew didn't add up in terms of the narrative that was being put out on the mainstream media, that this was an attempt to take over the world, and President Carter stands up and he says this is the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War, and all of this stuff. And when we went in and actually, got into the story and covered it and went to Afghanistan, we found out that there was no reality to it at all. And so these are the kinds of things that, and this happened again, this is 1979. So when people look at things like the Iraq War and how the false intelligence was, obvious and used, we're repeating and repeating and repeating the same crises over and over again. So we have to ask, why can't we move beyond it?
Well, they're also repeating a false narrative. And so, but the fact is that it's been repeated so many times at this point, it's like making the 32nd remake of a movie, Everybody knows what the plot is.
Right.
And so as a result of that, I think the credibility of the people who are carrying that narrative is at an all-time low. I mean, look at the popularity ratings of Congress and the president and all the other basically authority figures. It's like nobody believes it anymore.
And it's not even just in the United States. This is all over the world. The whole concept of government is sort of collapsing.
So we've kind of the people. We've grown too smart, and we've grown too educated, and we've grown too intelligent for the leadership that is trying to keep us in the same, playpen that they've had us for the last 2,000 years. It's time that people just finally stepped forward and said, look, you people can have your little world on top of a mountain someplace or on an island maybe out in the Pacific, but please leave us alone. Let us get on with life. And that's what we just want to do. I think that's what most people want to do. But instead, the institution wants to categorize us, wants to pit us against each other, wants to,
That is actually the secret to their power.
They're trying. Well, that's maintaining the dialectic.
That is
that's
exactly
what keeps
it.
the
To
dialectic.
maintain the dialectic, they just keep you at odds with each other, and the elites just keep moving along doing what they do. And that's why it's very important to seize these opportunities that we were talking about Tucker Carlson, who was talking to Max Blumenthal, who was very well known, on the left, and he was having a very calm conversation with him. And earlier in the week, apparently, he was having a very angry conversation with Max Boot, who is one of the high-level neocons who was pushing the war agenda and also the Russiagate agenda. And again, he was being asked for facts. He was being asked to justify how he could be so powerful when he made so many mistakes, let's say in the Iraq war predictions and things like that. He would not get an answer out of him. And I think it's very important for people to begin to understand, again, this mystical power, which is really something that people, especially Americans, I think, do not take seriously. In fact, the word mysticism, many people at the political level think that that's absolutely anathema to a political discussion to bring up anything to do with mystical or with spiritual. And this has been a real problem. That's why I like this quote, to give people an idea of how important it is to understand the nature of the dimensional power that these people are working from. This is actually a quote from Lawrence of Arabia, and who was someone that I think most people realize worked very closely with the British elites and obviously fronted for them and in their empire building. And this is a quote from him. He said, "Those who dream by night wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible." This
wonderful quote.
Exactly. So he witnessed when this mystical power, and I said the term mystical imperialism was coined for Rhodes. This is a time period that you would have had a man like Lawrence of Arabia spying in the Middle East and doing what he was doing. So you can see that and probably back then it was more accepted that there really was a mystical quality, and dreams had a very big part in mystical power.
There was a lot of this talk of manifest destiny, there were all these representations of Columbia for the United States. It was a, sort of a Greek goddess type of, who's that? Athena. It was a very Athena-looking type
The
of...
warrior goddess.
And then it was
right.
Britannia for the British Empire, and it was this very Athena type of figure floating over the battlefield and things. And then I guess this became a little more technocratic and became more about, what you were talking about, getting off of maybe the manifest destiny, which is it's like making a dream come true type of thing. That's
Exactly.
Well, we are now dealing with the technology in terms of biotechnology, in terms of genetic sciences, in terms of electronics, in terms of all the things that medical science. The institution has enormous amounts of resources. I mean, 100 years ago, they couldn't do the kinds of things that they can do today. And they still had maintained control of society, but they had to come out with with force in order to do it. The fact is, today that kind of power can be had through various means. I mean, we're talking about at this point what it actually means to be a human being. What does it mean when they can upload your consciousness into a cyber computer, something in cyberspace, and have you floating around the galaxy, and accessing your bits and your bytes at will? I mean, what kind of a world is that? What does it mean to be a human being when you actually don't have to go out and farm the land or hunt for the food to put on your table to feed your family? So what does it mean? We know it means something very different today than it did 100 years ago, than it did even a generation ago, 25 years ago.
Sure.
They don't. The powers that be don't want you driving your own car. They don't want you cooking your own food. They want to be able to have your refrigerator basically order the food from Amazon and fly it to your house by a drone.
And keep tabs on every calorie and everything that you ate.
Exactly.
Or even,
exactly.
begin telling you what to. Yeah.
You can imagine the insurance industry basically, checking in on everything that you're purchasing or not purchasing and all of that, and getting demerits for ordering up a chocolate bar or something like that.
Yeah, so
the insanity of it is
the potential.
it's there. I think it's there.
Well, the potential
Yeah,
for
I
negative
agree.
is there too.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
my
I
point.
think that's the point, though, about...
That's why we have to become conscious of the fact that the younger generation especially, I mean, we've already got to the point where we've seen so many of these things that we took for granted just simply disappear. They just fade away. They get discontinued. They're not there any longer. And here you are basically living in a world. There's a scene from a movie, Avalon, in which Arnold Mueller-Stahl talks about his character. He came here to the United States in 1917. And he's talking as an old man, and he's saying, I went back to the neighborhood that I lived in, and all the buildings were torn down. Then I went to the bar that I used to own, and that was gone too. And he says, I began to wonder whether I ever existed. And so,
Because everything is...
so then you really start to think about, well, what exactly does it mean to have that kind of existence when all the things that you did tactily involve yourself with, all the physical aspects of your existence aren't there to interact with anymore? I'm beginning to feel that way myself about my own background, where I came from. As family members die and move away, go someplace else. The high school I went to gets torn down. You go to a reunion and we look at each other and we're strangers.
I know.
After all those years. So you say, wait a minute, what was that experience anyway? Was that a dream that I had? Did I really play football on that football team? Did I really score those touchdowns? Or was that something that I just imagined? Did I dream that? Well, if we get into a future whereby, we have this virtual reality, you begin to wonder, well, maybe it was some kind of, implant or something,
that actually is exactly why one of the things we wrote The Voice about, our novel. It was at a time, this would have been, during the 1990s when we wrote it, but we could see down the road that the technology was really going to easily co-opt people's lives. And we questioned. And that's one of the quests that we went on, was tying the idea of the Gorell quest for us personally into understanding where are we really going here. And it was connected through the politics of the day. We connected it to the questions that were raised when we did go to Afghanistan and did discover that There was a secret agenda that came out of President Carter's White House through Zbigniew Brzezinski to actually trick the Soviets into Afghanistan, and that it was something that obviously was of no interest or no concern, especially in 1998 when Brzezinski actually publicly told everyone about what he had done, that it really didn't matter because the narrative that the institution, the CIA, and the media wanted to believe was that the evil empire proved to us that they want to take over the world, so now we get to do whatever we can to destroy them. And that was all part of the motivation for what they did, which actually really laid the foundation for the refugee crisis we are actually witnessing today coming out of all these Muslim countries was actually spawned by Brzezinski's activation of extremism to basically try to destroy the Soviet Union when they finally took his bait and went into Afghanistan. What they really wanted was that they should never leave until they hurt them enough. And they referred to it as giving them their own Vietnam. So this is clearly an example of a very, very horrific use of clearly imperial power, okay, where you can see that Americans have no idea what's been done in their name. And today, it really drives me crazy that President Carter is viewed as one of the few great presidents we ever had. And people have no idea that they're
by so-called progressives.
Yes, exactly.
Because right-wing people think that he was the biggest disaster in U.S. presidential history.
No, I'm talking about the ones who are impressed that he, obviously is very dedicated to helping poor people find homes and the Palestinian issue. Mm-hmm. That's what people focus on, but people don't focus on what he actually did as president through Brzezinski. He actually helped activate the nightmare we're living in today.
That's true. Very true. So much of what Brzezinski did is alive and well, except for recently. Very interesting. I just heard yesterday that Trump is going to stop the CIA's program to arm what do you call them? The non-extremist
moderate
whatever.
The so-called moderate rebels.
Moderate extremists?
Moderate
rebels. Right, moderate extremists, exactly.
Moderate extremists, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that really is very interesting that obviously came out of the meeting he had with Putin, that there might be an actual step taken in that direction would be quite significant.
Well, the way CNN was painting it is that this is just him trying to play in, be nice to Putin, and it's like, how about it being nice to the American people and to the Syrians?
Well, it's also this is what I love about the refugee crisis in Europe and in the United States, where nobody on the mainstream media ever talks about the bombing of all these Muslim countries being the cause.
Yeah.
I mean, if Afghanistan had no refugees in 1977, okay, before Brzezinski targeted Afghanistan to be the place where he was going to trick the Soviets in, all right, they, I think, are now our number two. The country is completely destroyed. There is no real sovereignty. There is no real people at this point.
So many. I mean, Syria, and for the most, for a large part of Syria, could be described similarly. Yes. And what you have then is people who are suffering from a much more extreme form of schizophrenia that you described, of going, having your high school torn down and nothing being what it was, and it's like, what is anything anymore? These are people who think, like their entire civilization. I mean, go to Libya. Libya is no longer. I mean, Libya is
exactly. Well, we know Iraq.
It's the same. I mean, when you see the videos, the drone flyovers in places like Syria, Damascus, and the outskirts, and Raqqa, places like that, it's absolutely devastating. The kind of world that has been created for these poor people to live in. Yeah. And these used to be very sophisticated societies. They were very, 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 and had been for quite some time. I mean, even after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire.
Well, so many empires. It's been the crossroad of so many.
Well, it's a continuing process, and I think we have to look at it that way, and that's why we've got involved with. We're going back 100 years and looking at Oswald Spengler, who wrote *Decline of the West*. Mm-hmm. Form and Reality was the title of the book, and it was very revolutionary at the time because he looked at Western society as an organic whole, and he basically, as opposed to it being, the progress and on a linear progression. And he said, you get to the point. He says it's a cyclical society. It's a cyclical thing. You've got winter, spring, summer, and fall, and then we go back to winter again. And that's what kind of we're heading back into winter. But we don't have anybody. We don't have any people who can in a position of leadership who can actually advise us as to what kind of state we're in. We just have these panicked responses, but from the neocons on the one hand and the so-called progressives on the other, who are just trying to say, who are in a food fight with each other. And the fact is,
it seems to me that they're just spouting neocon propaganda, the left, right now.
It's the dialectic, exactly. And what's happening is that the Democratic Party is now embracing the neocons because they've been, the Republican Party finally figured out what they were all about and said, there's really no home for you here any longer. So they're moving back over to the Democrats, and the Democrats are accepting them. I mean, this is absolutely unbelievable, because they represent money. They represent a source of power and money and influence. And the Democrats are so desperate to get that power and money and influence, they're willing to embrace basically a bankrupt theory that's really whose time has come and gone.
But I think it's important though to remember that's why it's so important when you do get people from the right and the left who come together. Like we're talking about with Tucker Forrest and Tucker Carlson and Caitlin Johnston, two people who are on opposite sides trying to talk to others, and yet they will be attacked for that. That's all part of what happens. And that's why it's so important to understand why we have such a weak left in this country is absolutely no mistake. This was intentional. What you might think of the left as being basically, all it is it's the farthest to the left of the right wing. There really is no left.
Right.
Anything that's authentic left doesn't have a voice. If you come across, and today I would say, if you come across as someone who doesn't want to play the dialectic, they don't want you. You've got to engage in the dialectic to get any attention at all.
People who are actually trying to fix the problem, trying to solve the problem and heal the situation in this country, are actually being attacked for doing it.
Right.
You're being attacked for reaching across the aisle and saying, we have to have peace here. We have to work out these solutions. And so this is a major problem, and the American public has to wake up to this.
Right. Well, that's why, when we commented about the series that we're doing, in the first series, we went out of our way to try and give people a deep enough understanding of the origin and the actual thinking that came out of World War II, very much so, that the idea that the Soviet Union had been ID'd as, the left, basically. But again, in thinking of the dialectic, where the left and the right are at odds with each other, if you think about the idea that that's where you get good and evil, that's why it was the evil empire. That's what the Soviet Union was referred to as by Ronald Reagan, I believe, publicly. And you have a genuine, reference to the fact that these are mythological in nature. These references. And this is again all part of what we feel a lot of the politics really has tried to avoid taking in some of the mystical qualities, and that's part of what is really it's connected to. When you refer to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, you are invoking mysticism. You are invoking a mystical quality in the geopolitics, and so we're now living in a world where those people like Max Boot, let's say, who had this big argument on Tucker Carlson's show, was basically just spouting anything. He was not speaking coherently, all right. And Carlson was trying to get an answer out of him, trying to get him to say, and address something specific. He would not address it because there was no answer. Because as soon as he could answer that question, he would have to come down to earth. And my personal opinion is, I think people like Max Boot are suffering from the daydream believer syndrome that Lawrence of Arabia identified. Exactly, that when you get caught up so much in that kind of power, it literally goes to your head. It's like you're not really in this world with us. And so that's why they begin to act as if they're in a daydream. And if you think about it, when you're in a dream, if you want to fly, you just fly. If you want a meal, it appears.
Right.
That's the way they seem to be functioning, as if they're in a daydream. They're not on this plane of reality, and they're using the power of the material world. I mean, how else could you end up with an atomic bomb being one of the greatest contributions the West has, ever offered, America has ever offered the world? That's kind of sad in a way, I would think.
Yeah, you're right. I think there were, during the W's administration, the neocons that were in there actually were on record saying that when people would correct their facts, they would just say, they were very pompous and very not unfazed by facts.
That's it. That's exactly.
They make facts of their own. I think
right.
they said.
Well,
right.
that's the daydream power. You don't have to do anything but just think it, and it becomes real.
Reality
that is exactly
is reality is what we say it is.
Exactly.
Not what you say it is. What we say it is.
Right, but they were in a position to turn those what really must be, said as fantasies into a reality because they had the power of the state behind them. But that's what's beginning to crumble now, that the use of the state is not even a way to protect
Well, they've
them.
accelerated it. I mean, I think there's a natural conclusion to all of this. There's a natural conclusion to empires. And I think that they've been so hasty and so greedy and so voracious in their appetite for power that they've actually hastened the decline and fall of the American empire. And everyone agrees. I mean, all the people that analyze these things, all the defense analysts that analyze this, a new study by a guy by the name of Nathan Freer. He put a paper out a few years back analyzing the state of the American military and how desperate it was. This was about 10, 12 years ago. Well, he's just come out with a new paper and basically saying they can't maintain the empire. And he's making all these recommendations about what they should do or how they should do it, and they should have more flexible units that can get to these places when they need to get there. But they admit that they really don't have an idea about what it is they're doing or how they're going to go about doing it. And the fact is that it's, as Bill Clinton said, you can't nail Jell-O to the wall. When it starts to come apart, there are just certain things that simply cannot be done. When it starts to disintegrate, it's disintegrating because of a natural process, which they've accelerated because they poured acid on it by invading Afghanistan and by invading the Middle East. And
this, by the way, is a government.
It's not going to be solved. Yeah, this is a government-sponsored document.
This is not an outsider.
This is them talking to themselves about what's going on. So we really are in a process of decline. There was an article on Der Spiegel the other day, the German news magazine, in which they basically, during the G20, they said, this is the end of the West as we understand it, as we know it. So the fact is that, and it's not as if Germany can just step forward and take control of the West, because the conditions aren't there. They've got their own enormous problems. They've got internal issues that go back past 100 years, the kind of conditions that created the dissension that produced World War I, and then again produced World War II, which was basically kept under the lid of the American nuclear umbrella and controlled by the Cultural Cold War. But all of those things are over. I mean, that's all been abandoned. The EU is pretty much was a CIA idea, and it was executed by the CIA and held together by the CIA.
Nazi/CIA.
Oh yeah, well they brought everybody. They brought them over lock, stock, and barrel. And
right.
Reinhard Gehlen's operation was just completely. He was running the intelligence operation in Eastern Europe and Russia during the war for Germany, and Allen Dulles just basically said, "Hey, you want to work for us at the end of the war?" Right. And he arrived with truckloads of material and dossiers on all these communists or alleged communists or whatever, nationalists, socialists at the end of the war, and they went right into the CIA's files. And he became the head of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, which was the West German intelligence operation. So. Well, it's all the same, and so that's breaking down now too.
But I think that's what's so important about what Spengler did by basically declaring very clearly that this decline was so visible at the early, obviously in the early 20th century, that he wrote a book that today is startling in its revelation.
It's more revealing today than it was 100 years ago.
But the denial was really part of the problem. He gave people an understanding of something that could have helped us avoid, and instead it seemed to exacerbate their belief. Paul Nitze actually, the famous neocon Paul Nitze, the man who was behind the missile gap crisis in the Kennedy administration, which was phony. He was one of the early neocons going back to FDR, and he absolutely made it his business when he read Decline of the West that he was going to stop it. He was going to stop the decline. That was his reaction.
He made it his goal in life.
Right. So this is part of the problem. We are living with those people who responded to something that could have been useful in this very outrageous way that became a part of the problem. And now we're living sort of with the final problem, and it's this big, messy, disintegrating monster that's living in Washington.
Right. Well, we've been talking about like the paradigm is incredibly materialistic and devoid of spirituality, and the same could be said about just Western secular culture as a whole. We don't really have models for death in our culture, which I have experienced firsthand. We don't have a very clear way of managing. We live in denial of death. We live in denial even of old age.
Oh, yes.
It's like only youth is allowed.
Right. Exactly. The obsession of trying to look 20, 30.
So that's why I like living in the northern hemisphere, and the northern part of the northern hemisphere is because you rust a lot slower.
I don't know. Vitamin D is good. Helps you stop rusting. But anyway, well, it's always great to talk to you guys. I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon. This is Liz Gould, Paul Fitzgerald, authors of The Voice, a book about the sort of the denouement, the unraveling of the Western dream that we're living today, and sort of the origins, the mystical origins of it, with little known. It's a book of fiction, but it's really talking about what we're living through now, and it's sort of this post-human thing versus, I guess, a genuine spiritual relationship with your life and an engagement in your life and in your own story, becoming present. So, always wonderful to speak to you too. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.